Good morning, man. What's up? Here,
Hey, good morning. How's it going?
it's going good, man. I was just letting everybody know I'm going to do my best to. I've never actually hosted a Zoom meeting with more than like five people on it, so hopefully I won't run into a bunch of technical issues. But um, okay, cool. And I know this is your time and you're being very generous with it, Dominic. So if it's okay with you, we'll just kind of dive right in. And if for some reason you got a hard stop or you need to cut it off, you just let me know. But I told everybody, 9:30 is pretty much where we're going to cut it off. So
Cool. And I got plenty of time.
okay, cool, good to know. So you saw, obviously, I tried to do my best to consolidate a lot of the questions and the sentiment that was coming in from teachers, parents, staff, community members. I mean, you saw the questions. I think, the last time I spoke with you, I had yet to go to any one of these town halls or really talk to any teachers or even parents that actually had kids in the schools that this is affecting. Since then, I went to the Stevens Town Hall where they tried to address questions and concerns about NES, met a few parents there that are much, much closer to this than I. And after speaking with you, I felt 1% smarter. And then after getting a little closer to this stuff and going to some of these Q&As, I feel now 100% concerned and confused because the sentiment definitely feels very, I can't seem to find a teacher, a parent, community member that is excited about NES. It feels like there's a really hard rejection coming from everybody, and it's wrapped in fear and concern, and I feel like also mostly just confusion about what exactly this is, and it definitely also feels like a huge judgment, right? It feels like the schools are being judged, the teachers are being judged. So I think a lot of people are just curious, like, well, how is NES going to be held accountable, right? If they're judging us so hard and making these sweeping downgrades, and they're coming in saying like y'all are not doing a good enough job, essentially, where's the accountability? When will the accountability flip? When are they going to be transparent with us? Because now that now that things are happening and it's rolling out, it doesn't seem like anybody can stop this thing. um it just feels like we're being brushed off, or like people are reading from a script, like we're just getting canned responses. um and again, I'm trying my best to speak for myself, so I don't represent anybody here at all, but just trying to stay smarter and spread awareness, and that's it. So I'll shut up now.
Yeah, I mean, so just to start out and make sure I'm being fair, I have found a couple parents who I quoted in the most recent story I wrote who are open to NES. The administration has also done these series of events that they call Straight from the Source, where they invite community members, whether they're teachers, principals, students, and they kind of share their experiences in a setting moderated by the district. And people have had nice things to say about NES there. But I do also agree that, like, when you go out and you kind of put a microphone in front of people and talk to them, there is a lot of hesitancy, and then there is a large community of folks who do view this as something that's outright harmful. So the way I've continued to phrase it is that it remains very divisive and is generating a lot of mixed feelings amongst the community. Um, in terms of how you asked about accountability and how we'll be tracking outcomes. So at the district level, I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with the TEA appointed board of managers. They're the ones who are setting long-term goals for the district. So over the next 5 years, NES is a big driver of these goals. Over the next 5 years at the district level, they want to see improvements in the percentage of students who, on the state standardized test, are meeting whatever grade level standards there are. As part of that, they also want to see a narrowing of the gap in test scores between affluent and working class communities, which in this case they break down by race. Um, so whether or not like those goals are met over time is one thing that we'll see in terms of how the Board of Managers holds NES accountable. The other kind of big question mark in the long term is that we do have an elected board. They don't hold policymaking power right now, right? They were replaced by this management board. But Education Commissioner Mike Morath has said he wants to transition back as soon as possible. It will happen at some point. And right now, if you talk to the elected board members, because they still exist, they're still in office, um, they are much more split than the management board. And at some point, there'll have to be a reconciliation, right? If you have these policymakers who are elected coming back onto the board, and a large chunk of them are either skeptical or outright oppositional to these changes. I think that that's where I'm looking into the future with a lot of interest to see how that process works out. Um, and just to very briefly say how it works, in June of next year, Commissioner Morath will make a decision to either extend the placement of this management board or to begin the transition back to local control. And if they do transition back to local control, the elected board comes back in groups of 3 every year. And so it's like kind of this staggered approach where power is slowly handed back to, in a democratic way, Houstonians. And so throughout that time, like there's going to be that push and pull that's going to be really interesting to watch. But yeah, to answer the question, when it comes to accountability, for the Board of Managers, a big piece of it is test scores, and it'll take time for those to come in, obviously, a few years to really be able to establish a trend.
Really quick, so when you that little piece that you just said about it going back to the locals, if that were to occur in regards to the board, would that then give the schools the ability to choose to opt into NES, or will that, or is that a question?
That's a question. And I think it's going to be a really interesting one to see play out. Um, the current leadership appointed by the state, in their public comments, they paint NES as something that's a lot less controversial than it is. They argue that critics are naysayers or outliers. These are words they have used. When in reality, you know, the teachers union, which represents about half, more than half of the teachers in the district, lots of community members, and a decent chunk of the elected board have been very critical. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there between rhetoric and reality. And we're gonna, like, the district will have to grapple with that at some point. And I think, to answer your question, as the elected board members come back on, and especially at the end of this staggering that we mentioned, where they come back in groups year after year, I mean, eventually they'll be on the board again, they'll have complete power. And there will be that question of, do they maintain NES or do they dismantle it? What do they keep in place that the current leadership is putting into policy? And even beyond NES, every school in the district will eventually see changes, because the plan right now is not this coming school year, but the school year after. The district wants to convert all educator salaries to a pay for performance model, where salaries are tied largely to test scores, to classroom observations, to some other stuff. But that's a shift from what we have right now, where teachers make more based on how many years of experience they have. They can plan for the future. Um, and so, like, even beyond NES, there are going to be district-wide changes. And so I think that there's all sorts of question marks in terms of how that will play out once regular Houstonians who vote in these races kind of regain that control.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so there's definitely a lot of parents on this call who, and you've mentioned this before, and I don't see a whole lot of it coming out, but as far as the perspective of the students, like I know parents are very vocal, teachers are going to be very vocal about the changes and NES in particular, but have you spoke to any more high school students, middle school students, what's their sentiment? Like, are they as up arms? Are they as upset about these changes as the parents are? Like, is there any sort of sentiment there.
I think on the student level, I have heard mixed reactions from students at Wheatley and Kashmir, where I've spent a lot of time. I'll start with students who've had positives to say. Um, I do pretty consistently hear that they prefer this slightly more controlled, disciplined approach at these particular schools. A few students I've spoken with. Um, there are students who will tell you that they feel like they're able to get more work done now, that there's less disruptions, and that they do appreciate that. There are also students who do not feel that way, who feel like this discipline approach is impersonal, that they've lost teachers that they value relationships with. And often some of the students that you hear that from are the ones who need it the most. Um, and even beyond that, there are students who feel like what they're actually learning in class isn't meaningful, who feel like it's busy work, who feel like they can see stress in their teachers, who are having to work through this model. So I think it's like a really big mixed bag when it comes to students. But I mean, even at Madison High over the past couple weeks, we saw a lot of headlines about cell phones, but when you kind of looked at what students were saying, they were talking about some of the NES strategies in terms of why they walked out of school, even citing them as some of the kind of stressors that led to the fights. Of course, the administration has argued it's mostly the cell phones. But yeah, when it comes to students, I think that there is quite a bit of anguish that some are feeling as a result of these changes, as a result of educator turnover. But there are also some students who are doing just fine and also maybe even like some of the changes and feel optimistic about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so for anybody on the call that's listening, I don't want to hog these questions up or hog Dominic's time. We've definitely got some people on this call. I see some teachers here. I see some people who I know have kids in some of these schools. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and jump in here and ask some questions, please feel free to do so. Or if you don't feel confident enough to say it out loud, if you want to drop it in the chat, you guys are more than welcome to do that. So please feel free to jump in. And I think we've got perfect. That's who I wanted to hear from. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Nick, for inviting and getting this group of people together.
Sure.
My main question, so I do have two of my both of my kids at Stevens Elementary. It's our zone school. We've had a great experience so far, and so yes, we're very nervous about what this new school year looks like. And one of my main questions is around the amount of money that's being invested into the schools. So last week or so, whenever we went to the presentation where the principal talked through the DIAD program and these extracurriculars are going to be available, it sounds great, right? It sounds like who wouldn't want their kids to have a photography class? Who wouldn't want their kids to have a music class and all those karate class and all those kinds of things? And I'm really curious on the amount, and I asked this question there too, but they weren't able to answer it. I'm curious about the amount of money that's being invested into the schools. Like I think by now they would have an idea. Okay, it takes from $500,000 to $1 million, for example, just to put these programs in place to bring these teacher assistants and these warm bodies in here. You know, it costs money, and I'm just curious. Do you know if HISD has a number, a range of what it takes to do these? And then the next thing for me is like, okay, how would they sustain this? So it's not meant to be a plan for just they're going to come in and do this for 1 year. So do you know any of those numbers, what that looks like?
So when it comes to cost, I remember Miles had previously mentioned over $100 million, I believe, just for the first year of NES. And since then, there's been talk of that number ballooning. We also, as a district, are facing a $250 million budget deficit. A lot of these questions, I'm waiting to see how the budgeting process plays out over the next few months. So in Texas, school districts have to finalize their budget by the end of June. And so over these next few months, we'll see the budgeting process play out. We'll hopefully hear some more specifics, but there is kind of this looming fiscal, you could call it a cliff, a crisis, like, but we're across Texas, right? Federal dollars that school districts got during the pandemic are about to run out. Over the past year, we saw the state legislature fail to increase funding for public schools, as that fell flat during the school voucher fight. And so kind of both at the federal and state funding level, there's a big issue. And so locally, NES is more expensive. Miles has previously said that more than $100 million figure, and they are currently engaged in deficit spending. And so he's said that he hopes to get the budget balanced at some point by cutting other stuff. So there's that big question mark of like, okay, what else will be cut? There were already some central office cuts over the summer. And yeah, so in terms of per pupil spending, per campus spending, those are some questions that I'm trying to get at through the records process, and also hoping just to maybe hear what that looks like in the budgeting process. But it's a good question. It's expensive. And in terms of sustaining it, like, I think Houston itself is kind of a good place to look at from the Terry Greer years when he implemented his own reform program here about a decade ago, only in about 20 schools. And when he left, the board deemed it in part slightly too expensive, and that was part of why it kind of ramped down. And so, yeah, there's a lot of questions about how much will be spent, where the money's going to come from, whether the state will ramp up funding, and yeah, how sustainable it will be. So I know that I answered your question with more questions, but
Right.
yeah, there still is a big question mark on that one.
Dominic, and before, I just want to remind anybody who maybe just now got on the call, please feel free, guys, if you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourself, jump in on the video. You know, it's definitely an open forum if you want to ask a question that you feel like hasn't been covered yet. Dominic, I was curious, especially for the last, I don't know, definitely this last 6 months, there just seems to be like, I know I'm personally confused about like what I feel like, is this really happening, or is this propaganda? Is this a myth? Is like, are they really ripping all the books out of the library? Or are they boarding up the libraries? So have you, because you're going to so many of these different schools, and you're in front of so many people, and so much closer to this, have you come across anything that you've seen in the headlines, like they're shutting down every single library, that just isn't true? Like stuff like that, like you know, shutting down the libraries, that all teachers and staff are having to reapply for their jobs. People are just being like, anything like that, anything that, you know, like, hey, I've seen this, but it's just definitely not true, or you don't have to be so worried about this because it's not actually happening.
I mean, so just to address two of the things you just said, when it comes to teachers reapplying for their jobs, that happened at the original 28 NES campuses over the summer, this past summer. This time around, educators will have to go through what they're calling a proficiency screening, where basically they look at student test scores, classroom observations, what the principal thinks of a teacher, and that kind of determines whether or not they stay at the school. So this time around, it's not reapplying, it's a proficiency screening. When it comes to the libraries and the books, I think it's been interesting to watch the administration frame what the community is saying as misinformation. I think there's been, to be fair, slightly hyperbolic descriptions of it, but ones that aren't far from the truth. So Miles really hates when folks refer to the teen centers as discipline areas. That's like his biggest quip. They are, to be fair, spaces used for differentiated instruction and discipline. So students who are disruptive in class are removed, sent to the team center, they zoom back into class there. Some folks have labeled that detention center. Miles has argued that's just complete misinformation, even though folks do understand the dynamics there and are describing it in their own way. Um, and the other part of the team center is after kids take the quizzes at the end of every class, they break into groups, and this is where the differentiated piece comes in. The folks who do well on the quiz go to the team center, and they continue with one of these centrally created lessons over there. So yeah, in terms of the libraries, like I have not been able to visit an NES school yet. I've asked many times and have been told to continue waiting. Other folks who have visited NES schools and seen the team centers have reported that there are still books there, but of course, with this model, there's no librarian. So I think that that's when it comes to kind of the conversation and the discourse around the libraries. Miles has felt very aggrieved and that it's unfair the way folks are talking about it, but I do think there's this understanding amongst the community where they know exactly what it is and they're describing it the way they are, and Miles feels like it's unfair. So yeah.
Got you. Well, hey, Sarah or Tanya, these are the only, oh, here we go. So we've got Anya popping in.
This is Tanya. Hi, Dominic. Nice to
Howdy.
see you, speak with you. I don't think I've spoken with you before. Just a couple of things that I wanted to point out. You mentioned the disconnect, kind of a disconnect in what the administration says and what is actually happening, or what the teachers are saying. What is absolutely mind-blowing for teachers is to hear the daily source come out and know that that is not what is happening in our own very campus, and then the second part of that is the weekly source, straight from the source. Did you see the leaked script?
I did see a photo of that, and what I was planning to do was to submit some records requests to see if every single one of them has been scripted, and then I imagine the district will say that's just to streamline it. It's still genuine, but yeah, I saw the script.
Yeah, so that's what we're fighting against. When he says misinformation, it is just impossible for every single person he talks to be a huge fan and lover of NES. It is an impossibility. So there would be more credibility if he spoke with people who are not too sure about it, or had some concerns or whatever, but that is not what's being pushed out. And so I believe that that's the it is disingenuous. Let me change the word. And that's what it's to the point now where it's really propaganda. It's not just promotional materials. And my real question on that is, how much are these camera crews costing the district? And is there a return on that? There's no, how do the students benefit from that?
That is a great question, and one that I hadn't thought of and that I'm going to look into. I know the Houston Chronicle had done that good story about how much the convocation that happened over the summer cost, almost $500,000, if I'm remembering correctly. Which, as the district pointed out, relative to the
470,000.
Right, which, as the district pointed out, isn't a huge sum relative to the size of their budget, but also is much larger than other districts spent on similar convocations. And also, I think, was a really good moment that gets at this disconnect that we're talking about. Like, I understand like entities advocating for their own perspective, like they do that. In this case though, like I remember the convocation happening, just hearing a lot of like, and again, this was like the first time, you know, teachers were kind of really getting back to work from the summer for these training sessions and for this musical. And I mean, the feedback that I was hanging outside the convocation center just chatting with folks as they came out. And yeah, it was hard. Like I did not find anyone who was like, that was great. This was a really well organized week. I really enjoyed the musical. Superintendent Miles says he did get a lot of that feedback. But again, at most, if what the superintendent was saying is true and there was all this great feedback, I was also hearing a lot of negative feedback from folks just in the parking lot or who reached out to me. And so I remember there was a press conference that was held that week, and he was asked about this negative reaction. And that was one of the first times where I heard him say, like, no, it was great. Those are naysayers. Those are outliers. Those are anecdotes. Don't report the anecdotes. Report what we actually did. And so, like my job is to go talk to people, listen to them, hear what they have to say, like think critically about it, and then do a story that's accurate and fair. Like those are my top two things, is to be accurate and to be fair. And when everyone that I'm able to find and talk to, even by doing man on the street stuff, right, where I'm just like walking around where I know people are going to be, or where I'm like kind of lurking online and reaching out to as many people as I can, like this is that disconnect that we're talking about, where I don't think there's been a full acknowledgement about just kind of the scale of opposition, the genuineness of the opposition. Like, again, to be clear, like I've talked to folks who are either open-minded to NES at the parent level or who like some of the changes at the student level. I've also heard from an NES campus principal who I'm in touch with on a regular basis, who's a fan, even though they also say they're scared for their job. So it's this thing where like, yeah, the kind of divisiveness and the different takes on it are a lot more prominent, I think, on than the administration would like to acknowledge. So yeah, there is a disconnect.
Yeah. And were you able to, here, let me, so I know you had your hand raised. Just make sure.
Yeah, hi.
Go
Hey,
for
Ann.
it.
Hey, thank you so much for organizing this, Nicholas. And good morning, Dominic. I really appreciate your reporting. I'd like to ask a little bit about special education. So, you know, when I was on the Houston ISD school board, I chaired a special education ad hoc committee. Knew nothing about special ed, even though I'd been a teacher, but got to learn from experts. And what I really took away from that experience was, and what the report said, is that special ed is a kind of everybody's responsibility. It's not, you know, something that happens in a removed classroom. It really is everyone's responsibility in order to be able to find students, in order to be able to serve them in general ed classrooms. I think we passed the resolution saying that special ed students are general ed students as well. And so it's really the responsibility of everybody. And the solution to do special education well is to make sure that everybody in your school system, principals, all teachers, all aides, really understand how to serve students with disabilities. Now, fast forward, I'm the parent of a child. She has dyslexia. She's on a 504 plan. And what I see in the NES model and then the training that district leadership is getting is not deep understanding of special ed. What I see is this kind of like building a system for churn so that you can have rapid turnover in teachers and principals, but have bodies to replace them quickly, and what they call high quality instructional materials. But what I'm worried about is that if people don't really have the deep understanding of how students with disabilities learn and how to differentiate for them, no matter how high quality the materials might be, and you know, I know there's differing opinions on whether they are high quality, but no matter that if you don't have people who really understand, and if you're turning over instruction so fast, I just don't see how this model works for students with disabilities. I mean, I've seen it affect my own child to a certain extent, even though we're not in an NES school, and I'm really worried for students district-wide. So all of that setup is like from your vantage point, because I only see it from one school. Like, what are you seeing for special ed?
I want to start with the turnover piece before circling back to special ed, because you're absolutely right. Superintendent Miles has explicitly stated, I think he had a blog post recently where he said that staff retention, turnover is not the key metric of success for NES. This idea of students having high quality instruction every single day is the key metric. And so he has the staffing model with the apprentices built in. So the idea being anyone can just step in and start teaching. And so with the centrally created curriculum that we're talking about, like, yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to see how perhaps someone could quickly step into that. But there are those bigger question marks around some of the stuff that like take some time. For example, special ed compliance and like giving folks their accommodations and knowing how to track those accommodations from 504s and IEPs. And all of these things are like, this is stuff that the conservators from TEA are tracking. It's full compliance in this area is one of the things that has to happen for the takeover to end. So I will say, I know part of the NES staffing model is more special ed staffers in the school, but still, like you said, there's this question of like, does the general ed teacher know how to do accommodations, know how to like, because yeah, like in general, special ed students are in the general ed classes, and that's what you want, and you want them to be able to access that material. And so for me, this is something that I want to continue reporting out, because one of the things that's kind of hard with special ed is like, there's all of this kind of paperwork related compliance. And so, for example, one of the things that the conservators from TEA want is IEP reports go out on a regular basis where, you know, staffers are letting parents know, you know, these are the accommodations that we did this week. And for teachers, like, I know that's another thing on their plate in terms of just the tracking part, like the writing it on the paperwork, where the thing that really matters is how they put those accommodations into practice in the classroom and whether students are actually being able to get engaged into the material and learn. And so there's that paperwork piece where like we can watch the conservative reports and see what's being said about whether compliance is happening. But then we still have to from students when possible, and also from parents and from teachers, like in terms of like the actual ground level experience, like, yeah, is that access happening? So I think it's a great question, and one that I've been thinking about how to really kind of get into that NES model and figure out how students who get special ed services are doing. So yeah, I think it's something that I'm going to be looking into both through the conservator reports, but also by chatting with real folks.
If I could jump in real quick about how to get to that information.
I'd appreciate that. Yeah.
There are, if you reach out specifically to special education teachers, and I'll try to put you in touch with some that have shared anecdotes about this checklist spot form that when they come around and observe a special education class, this is not even in the gen ed setting, but when they observe a special ed class, they will actually mark teachers down or not give them points because their autistic nonverbal student is not turning and talking. One of the MRS strategies. there's an obsession with the MRS strategies that really is not pedagogically sound. And it's really prominent in a SPED setting. So they're looking for these students who have to be taught in a very specialized way to still fit the cookie cutter when their IEPs do not line up with what they are looking for from the teachers. So speaking to SPED teachers who have been told they need to, you may have a student who's at a second grade reading level, or I'd one at a kindergarten reading level, and they're supposed to complete the same DOLs in a gen ed. In a SPED setting, they're supposed to still complete them. How? I mean, it's really from a very practical standpoint. If you get into that, you will see why the teachers are so upset about it, and parents of SPED students, but particularly the teachers, because we see the ridiculousness. I guess you can see my opinions pretty clearly, but it's really insanity to expect differentiation and with this obsession with the timers and the start time, finish time. If a student is not where they need to be, and I'm from a non-NES school, if they're not where they need to be, I need to get them where they need to be. And to heck with the timer, with anything else, I have to serve that student. And I've told administrators, you're gonna, mark me down for whatever, because I'm serving this student. Give me zeros. I'm serving the student. And you'll find teachers that are in that situation. And some are deciding to get marked down on their evaluation, their spot form, and serve the student. And some are not as willing to do that, and so the student isn't getting the service. They'll do an MRS or do something that has not in any way that does not reach the student, just so that it can be checked on the box, and the administrators will check it on the box.
I definitely love to connect with those educators you mentioned. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I want to make sure, because we've only got 2 teachers on the call. I know Sarah has had her hand up for a minute. If that's okay with you, Dominic, just to give Sarah a quick little minute. And then after that, I just want to check in with Dominic's time to make sure he doesn't need to bat out of here. But Sarah, by all means.
Let me know if the noise behind me is too loud. I'm in a coffee shop because I'm also in grad school. So I'm trying to get my principal certification so that maybe some things can change. But anyways, to speak to Anne is actually a parent on our campus, and we are a non-NES campus. But that is a very real concern for educators across the entire district, whether they're NES or non-NES, that the systems that are in place now for all campuses, this idea that non-NES schools have autonomy is not true. And I will say it to anybody directly I will say it over and over. It is not true that non-NES campuses have autonomy. All campuses are using that same spot form. All campus administrators are praised using the same formulas, scores, everything. We just had this week an instructional review team come for our principal evaluation. They came on Friday. One of the things that they were most concerned about in our feedback was that we were giving students too much time, too much think time, and that things that our teachers may have given students 8 minutes for should have been done in 3 or 4 minutes. Those were their exact words. In our classrooms, our school, one of the things, I've worked at my campus for 22 years. It is a school that believes in inclusion. So our classrooms are filled with GT students, students of emergent bilingual, students under special education, students with 504 plans. We have students with autism in our classrooms because we want our children to be people of the world. We want them to be exposed to all kinds of different perspectives. And our teachers know who our students are. And the idea that this time to ponder concepts and ideas and transfer it to new situations has to be limited to a 3 or 4 minute box. We have now missed opportunities to know what student misconceptions are. We have missed opportunities to know what students think who are ready to move on and go beyond. So it goes beyond just the special education student, and I'm greatly concerned about that because those students, that's legal. You can't walk in and say this person has to get this done in 3 minutes when you know that student legally is allowed extra time. But that's true of our emergent bilinguals. And it's also true, I think, lost in a lot of this is our gifted students. Giftedness doesn't necessarily mean speed. And so I just want to throw that out there. It is a very real concern for me as an educator. Everything I'm doing in grad school contradicts everything that HISD is currently doing. But I also want to note for the record that I was told by a professor at A&M that I am being watched. And they wanted to know what school I worked at and what the purpose was for me getting my master's degree. And I had to send A&M a notice that said, you will not share my information in that way with the district. And that was concerning me because my program is outside of the scope of HISD. This is not in line with HISD. So, and I know they're probably watching to see who are future administrators. I get that. But in this climate, it's just very disconcerting. But as an educator and as a parent who also has children with 504, it is something that all parents across the board, NES, non-NES, should be more aware of.
Yeah, and these are concerns that I've heard from a lot of folks. So there's this remarkable centralization, right, of curriculum, but not just curriculum, also how you teach the curriculum. And you mentioned this idea of non-NES campuses don't have the same level of autonomy as they used to. Also something I've heard, although I have heard differences based on each school's principal and how much they're either kind of pushing for their teachers to be able to do what they've been doing or kind of going along with what the district is asking. But yeah, you mentioned the spot observation forms, like MRS strategies are on there, having your DOL on the board is on there, and they are using those forms for every single teacher. And we mentioned earlier in the call, pay for performance. Every educator in the district in about 1.5 years, not this next school year, but the school year after, every teacher in the district will have pay for performance. So, and even the recent NES expansion, you know, it'll be 130 schools in NES in August. It'll eventually be 150. So yeah, there are going to be more changes, both within NES expanding, but also across the district. And I think that that is something that perhaps folks parents, community members at some of the non-NES schools maybe aren't fully aware of yet, is how these changes will kind of continue to trickle across the entire district.
Got you. Dominic, how are you doing on time?
I'm good on time. Yeah. If folks have more questions, I'm happy to stay.
Okay, great. Yeah, I saw she'll jump back in here. I hope I'm doing a decent job of catching people. I see people keep throwing their hands up. If y'all have any issues or feel like you're being ignored, feel free to drop a message in the chat. I just saw Xochitl come and go. Well, perhaps this might be the, oh, here we go. There's Dominic. Okay.
Yeah, so Dominic, so my whole thing is bottom line is, my husband and I have been supporting the school with our time and money very heavily for 5 years. I'm talking about Stevens Elementary here that we're going to NES next year. We plan to continue to send our children this next school year. And I think my biggest thing is my continued devoted support to public education. But the thing is I would like to know, do you know which person or people or office I ought to just kind of know or meet or have their contact information so that if I really need to reach out to someone to hold them accountable to get answers as the school year goes, do you know where to point me to?
So it's interesting, Xochitl, that you asked that question. So that's, and I've wanted to ask the exact same question, maybe in a different way, but Dominic, for the people, and maybe I'm speaking only for myself, but for the people that feel powerless to this, that feel like they're on the sidelines and like this is just, they're just being steamrolled, like we want to get involved, we're motivated, we want to support the teachers, we hear that, you know, these massive concerns coming in. And for somebody that's, I'm not an insider, I'm not a reporter, I don't work for any establishment, like I don't have any connections, nothing, I'm just a parent who's concerned. How do we, is there anything that we could be doing to help move the needle in the way that Xochitl is asking? Like, is there somebody we should be blowing up? Are there letters we should be sending somewhere? Or is it just a matter of continuing to spread awareness?
Yeah, so just to kind of answer both questions, because I think the first one was more about if there are issues once the school year starts, who do we talk to? In general, I'd recommend that you still follow, you know, the chain of command. So teacher, principal, and if that's still going nowhere, there's a grievance process that you can follow at the district level. But yeah, like at least starting with the campus principal at that lowest level and seeing if you can build a relationship there and try to work things out. And then if that falls through and there's a big issue, there's a complaint process where it eventually goes before the board. In terms of this larger idea of like, if you don't like what's happening, what can you do about it? Like I'm being careful because it's not my job to advocate for anything or to tell anyone what to think, whether against or for. But if you feel motivated and engaged and like you don't like what you're seeing in HISD, there's a board meeting second Thursday of every month where there's public comment and you can speak directly, usually to the superintendent as well as the board of managers. Their emails are also on the website. So that's one forum to have your voice heard by them. And there's also usually reporters in the back of the room who are listening, and I'm always gathering people's contact info from public comment. There are also, you know, grassroots organizations locally who are engaged in advocacy. A long list of them on who are both for or against the reforms. So I think it's worth looking around at the various groups and seeing if they match your values and if that's something that you'd want to get involved in. And yeah, like there also will be this point, like we mentioned earlier, where the elected board comes back. So I'd say know who your trustee is, like your elected trustee, even though they don't hold policy-making power. Reach out to them, you know, try and engage with them, make sure they know your thoughts, because when they're back on the board, you know, they will be accountable to you via the democratic process. And so I think like it's a good thing that folks are feeling more engaged with education policy than I think before. Obviously, all the teachers on this call have been thinking about ed policy for a long time, but I do think this past, you know, half year is one of the first times that at the parent level, like folks are really exploring what all of this means and how all of it works. And so I think that there's all sorts of opportunities to kind of engage further with the process. And I would encourage folks to do that. if they're upset or if they're happy, if they like something, if they don't like something. Yeah, like find the groups, the folks that match your values, and then also try to engage in dialogue with the folks who don't, even if you don't like what they're doing.
And I know you have to be neutral and just provide information. So I apologize. I'm not on the journalistic side, or I don't have that hat. So I know sometimes I'm asking you for opinion, and I don't mean to put you in an awkward position.
All good, all good.
If nobody else, I see Tanya's hand is up. If you want to jump in, please do. But if nobody else has any other questions or comments, I just want to thank Dominic for giving us his time just to help us get smarter on this subject. So this is sort of last call. Tanya, do you want to make any more comments at all?
Yes,
Okay.
I don't mean to take over any, but you've got an awesome reporter in front of you, it's hard to not talk.
Please,
So,
yeah.
so speaking of awesome reporter, I think that I wanted to commend you to a large degree on the NPR piece you did, where you intermixed your interview clips. I thought that was incredibly effective because you were able to give the background and then give the specific question answer. So I would love to see that continue in whatever other issues that you look at, and see, and kind of do it in that format. That was a very, very effective format, in my opinion. And speaking of that format, I would love to see that kind of format addressing the Open Meetings Act, the Texas Open Meetings Act, because there is no way that board members can vote 9-0 with no deliberation of board members without having deliberated behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think Margaret Downing, I haven't actually read the story yet, but from Houston Press,
Yes.
I think she either had done a story or was working on a story about some of the open meeting stuff that sounded really interesting. I was planning to look into that as well in terms of how the current board is grappling with this stuff, because again, one of the reasons that this district got taken over in the first place was prior elected trustees violating the Open Meetings Act.
Yeah.
They weren't still on the board when the takeover happened, for the most part, but yeah, so there's that interesting question. And then thank you for the kind words about that segment. One of the things for folks on this call to watch out for is in mid-May, we're gonna be releasing a podcast called The Takeover that will explore how we got here, what it all means, but also at a very larger systemic level, like there's a lot of kind of test-based accountability that teachers, schools, students have been grappling with in this country over the past 2 decades. In some ways, it comes from Houston, it comes from Texas, it got exported to DC, it went national, and now it's back. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff that I'm excited to fold into that podcast, including some other segments from that interview you mentioned. So yeah, that's something for folks to watch out for in mid-May. HPM will have a podcast called The Takeover.
Awesome. Guys, well, thank you everybody so much, especially the teachers that showed up. I was hoping for that, but didn't expect it. And again, thank you, Dominic, for giving us your time. If y'all don't know who Dominic is, please look him up.